Very pleasant good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Magandang umaga, magandang tanghali, magandang hapon, at magandang gabi sa lahat ng nanonood at nakikinig sa atin ngayon. This is Rita Gadi, and this is your hour. So wherever you're located and whatever time zone you're at, this is a very important program that we're having this afternoon. It is by way of, not really closing, but by way of giving some conclusive questions. Wow, conclusive questions. Napakabigat naman ng statement na yon. But this has been part of the running commentary that we have been issuing over the past years regarding President Ferdinand Edralin Marcos. And so many questions have arisen regarding so many issues, martial law, human rights violations, whatever wealth the Marcoses had, etc. and all. But we have not really tackled the legal aspect of many of those events that occurred from 1986 onwards, so that there you could see that what is happening in the world today actually happened here in our country. What do I mean by what's happening in the world? Where you have powerful countries, for instance, who, well, I'm referring here to the United States of America, for instance, that if they do not like a certain country's leader, or they are not in agreeable with the way that country is conducting its government or its affairs, then they will do many things using their media and using their bureaucracy to be able to either remove the leader of that country or invade that country. So over the past decades, we have seen this done. For instance, we had the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, we had the entrance of forces into Syria. Of course, there was the element of the Islamic militants and all of this caliphate seeking militant Muslims who wanted to create their own their own caliphate, so to speak, in several parts of the Middle East. But then again, we have seen that in many ways, the United States of America enters into a country whenever it feels that there is something they do not agree with. Very recent, for instance, it is still fresh in our memory, the invasion of Iraq is one clear example of how they did not agree with the way Saddam Hussein took over the little place there, not little place, but this is Kuwait actually. I remember the time when Saddam Hussein actually said that Kuwait was a province of Iraq, and that one day he will be able to take over Kuwait, because then it was the British actually who separated Kuwait from them, so that Iraq will have to pass through Kuwait by paying, or they had to ask permission so that they could pass through to export their oil. And then of course you have the entrance also of America into Libya, because Muammar Gaddafi had his own theory of creating some kind of an African union, an Islamic union, where he would be supporting a lot of these Islamic countries in Africa. So that what was happening there was, well, of course, you had the bombing of one of the planes, American planes, for which Gaddafi, of course, apologized and paid dearly for that particular tragedy. But whatever it is, there you have a powerful country entering into other countries, either invading them or removing their leaders if they do not agree with the way that government is being run. I'm talking this way because we just had recently what the United States president has called a summit for democracy. President Biden has invited about 100 countries to attend this. A summit for democracy, meaning it is, he invited the countries that would be aligned with the United States of America in the democratic ideology. And this is coming after 75 years of the United Nations, where the world became dramatically and well, geographically and politically and ideologically divided between communism and democracy. So you had half, well, not really half, but you had the alliance of those that favored democracy or were actually implementing democratic ideals in their countries, and then you had the other countries like Cuba and the Soviet Union, and of course China, that are communists, and several of the satellite states of these countries. So there was the world actually where you have ideologically that kind of a division, diametrically opposed to each other. That is why it was called the Cold War. Now that the President Biden has called for this summit for democracy, it is like a roll call or a head count or a warm body count, so to speak, of those countries that are on the side of the United States of America. Because here we see that there seems to be this claim for hegemony over the world. Of course, what else is hegemony if it is not for the world? But anyway, you have some kind of a conflict going on with China on one hand, the Soviet Union, which is now called the Russian Federation, and the United States of America. What am I leading on to? Well, this is where countries like the Philippines, we have been categorized somehow as third world countries. And then you have several of South America and of Africa and several other small countries with their own respective leaders and presidents. And somehow, even if we are all members of the United Nations, we have to bow down to what the powerful countries have, would want to impose on smaller countries. And I wouldn't want to call them little presidents, but those that do not have the power, such as the nuclear power or the power of economic power to challenge all of this. And one clear example is the fact that the Security Council, you would not find little countries or small countries as members of the Security Council, and that is how they have some kind of an exclusivity. But here we have the powerful countries, and now we have the rising People's Republic of China, and of course the Soviet Union has always been a threat to the democratic ideal, so to speak, of the United States of America. But as I've said, let's go back to what it was after the Second World War and how the world seemed to be, not really seemed, that actually was divided between that ideological divide of communism versus democracy. And that's exactly, we've seen this quite graphically exhibited in Vietnam. And of course, the Americans had to leave Vietnam after so many decades of fighting surrogately the Vietnamese, but actually it was a surrogate war with the Soviet Union at the time. You must remember that the Soviet Union and all the satellite states was one of the most powerful communist countries at that time. And then we have the rise of China, and that is why over the past decades, we have seen that the American bureaucracy has come up with a pivot of Asia, meaning something is brewing here, or at least they would want to block the growth of China. And by doing this, which is thousands of navigational miles away from their land, actually, but that is because they want to stop the growth of China in a way, because the navigational highway of the South China Sea is actually the front door, so to speak, of the People's Republic of China, through which all its products and whatever else they sell to the world passes through. But then again, I'll discuss that a little later. But all of this points to the fact that with the calling of a of a summit for democracy, it is like a revival again of determining who are with the United States of America, or what is called as the democratic process, or that actually what would happen is that the other countries that do not align with the United States of America would be then either with the Soviet Union or with the People's Republic of China. So this is a revival of the Cold War, which was already thawing, as a matter of fact, so that what has been the concern of many countries actually is to just be economically viable as far as their respective governments are concerned, and and their growth and their progress. So ideologically and politically, that has not been an issue over the past many years. But it seems that now with this summit for democracy, we are again witnessing a division of the world, like who is in favor of the democratic processes or the democratic way of life that the Americans have and have given to several countries, like the Philippines, for instance, to which we are eternally grateful for all of these ideals of freedom, justice, and democracy. But be that as it may, this is how powerful countries move, and especially the United States of America. And that is why the title of our program here is The American and Swiss Actions Against Ferdinand and Ralin Marcos. Why am I zeroing in on Ferdinand and Ralin Marcos? Because he will be some kind of an example of how the bureaucracy of the United States of America and the Swiss government, because it holds many of the accounts of not governments, of individuals, because they do not, I do not think they get placements from governments. But be that as it may, you could see that the movement that is being done by financial institutions like the Swiss banks and of America with its bureaucracy, entering into and manipulating and maneuvering countries for the removal of their leaders, or the actions that have to be taken for changes in government that they would want to impose. So this is like the tail end of many of the things that I've discussed in the past. I've already raised the issues of the hidden wealth of President Marcos, or the unexplained wealth of Ferdinand Edralin Marcos, and of course, the human rights violations for which he's being accused. I've already discussed that quite lengthily, but I am going back and forth now with many of these things, but I have never discussed actually the actions taken by the American government and the Swiss government against Ferdinand Edralin Marcos. And this is being emphasized at this particular stage in view of the, not in view, but in connection with the fact that when a United States president calls for a head count of those that will be on their side, there you could see that some movement is actually going to be done, as it has already been done. Like, for instance, here in the South China Sea, you already had the recent AUKUS, which is Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, with all their navigational military vessels now plying the South China Sea for, again, as I've said, the containment of the People's Republic of China, so that it will have to be, this has to be controlled in many ways. But then again, before we discuss what happened in the South China Sea, let's just get back to this program that we have, which is the American and Swiss actions against Ferdinand Edralin Marcos, because these are all indicative of how the powerful country of the United States of America enters into and maneuvers through its bureaucracy many of the things that are happening, not just in the Philippines, but in many other parts of the world. But graphically, I would want to describe this here in our country, because this is where we have firsthand information. So I'd like to begin by saying that I'm reading this actually because I compiled many of this. So based on Father Joaquin Bernas, Jesuit, he wrote a commentary on the Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines. And I would like to quote what he has said here, because we are going to segue to many other items from this. This is a direct quotation from Father Bernas. In November 1985, the President Marcos, called for a special presidential election. Corazon Aquino challenged President Marcos for the presidency, and elections were held on February 8, which is actually February 7, 1986. On February 15, 1986, the Batasang Pambansa, which is our parliament, which is also the National Assembly as we call it, in the exercise of powers given by the 1973 Constitution, proclaimed Ferdinand Edralin Marcos as president. Subsequently, starting on the afternoon of February 22, 1986, Minister of National Defense Juan Ponce Enrile and Vice Chief of Staff General Fidel Ramos initiated a revolt against Ferdinand Marcos. Ramos and Enrile placed their support instead behind Corazon C. Aquino. On the morning of February 25, 1986, Corazon C. Aquino, in defiance of the provisions of the 1973 Constitution and without the sanction of the Batasang Pambansa, was proclaimed first woman president of the Philippines in simple rites held at the Club Filipino and was immediately sworn in by Senior Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Claudio Tihanqui. At almost the same time, and in virtue of the Batasang Pambansa Proclamation of February 15, 1986, Mr. Marcos was sworn in by Chief Justice Ramon Aquino at Malacanang. So that is from Father Bernas, and I continue. Within 60 days from the date of the proclamation, a commission was appointed by the president, his President Aquino, to draft a new constitution of not less than 30 nor more than 50 natural-born citizens of the Philippines of regional probity known for their independence, nationalism, and patriotism. They shall be chosen by the president. The 1986 Constitutional Convention convened on June 1, 1986, and finished the work on October 15, 1986. So those are the events that happened where we have the fundamental law discarded or abolished, or in a way, yes, it was discarded. And with the new administration of Mrs. Aquino, you have the Constitutional Commission chosen by her that wrote a new constitution. And this was the 1986 or 1987 Constitution. So we have here Corazon Aquino, who got into power in the name of a revolution. The revolution began with a statement issued by Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile saying that he was shifting his loyalty from President Marcos to Mrs. Aquino. Ramos subsequently followed, and they were supported initially by a handful of their military aides. The opposition against Marcos called on their followers to support Enrile and Ramos. People gathered at EDSA, a mixture of Aquino and Enrile supporters and curious onlookers. It is reported that several thousands gathered at the frontage of the military camps at EDSA. The population of Metro Manila was 7 million at the time. The population of the entire country was approximately about 57 million. In the name of what number of the people at EDSA was the Aquino government proclaimed? If they claimed power in the name of the number of people who voted for Aquino, what is that number? We never knew this. This was never made public. The official figures that we have from the Commission on Elections, even granting the removal of votes that were contested by the Aquino representatives at the national canvassing of votes held at Parliament. Remember, I've mentioned this. You had Bono Adaza, who was really called Mr. Asterisk because he was putting an asterisk on all of the votes that he was contesting. And even with that removal of all of those votes contested, on record, the Commission on Elections stated that Ferdinand Edralin Marcos obtained a higher number of votes cast in his favor and that he won by about 1 million votes in the presidential elections of 1986. Okay, so we now go to that question. A revolution is a criminal act against the state. It is for this reason that Defense Minister Enrile and Ramos armed themselves in the camps. They had decided to resist arrest and, I will quote what they said, to fight it out till death rather than surrender. If Marcos did order that they should be arrested in accordance with the constitutional right of the state to defend itself from any act of rebellion. But there was no order coming from President Marcos. So Marcos did not order the arrest of Enrile and Ramos. Marcos did not even order the military to disperse the crowd of civilians who were there gathered in front of the building where Enrile and Ramos were actually encamped. Enrile himself had noted this fact, and I quote what he said. and this is a quotation from Enrile's statement, had President Marcos ordered a full military assault on our forces at EDSA at the start of the uprising, history might have taken a different course altogether. These are records coming from the Senate, from Minister Enrile. So we have the question, does the act of rebellion become legitimate when the head of state chooses not to defend the seat of power? Okay. So Corazon Aquino entered into the seat of power because officials of the State Department of America agreed to her request to transport Marcos out of the Philippines. Malacanang was bombed from an unmarked helicopter that dropped 2 rockets that did not belong to the military inventory of the Philippine Armed Forces. The United States Embassy offered to transport President Marcos and his family out of Malacanang for safety. The president's family was brought to Clark Air Base. President Marcos requested that they be brought to the northern province, his home province. The United States Air Force plane instead took them first to Guam and then from there to Hicam Military Air Base in Honolulu. According to Senator Paul Laxalt, who was a Republican senator from Nevada, in his article, and I quote the title of his article, A Lesson in Personal Diplomacy. It was published by the Policy Review magazine in the summer of 1986. So this must be sometime March, April 1986. So here is a quote from the writing of Senator Paul Laxalt. It is important to understand that he, President Marcos, did not believe he was going to have to leave the country when he agreed to leave the presidential palace. He thought he was going home to Northern Luzon. Apparently, negotiations to permit the Marcoses to go home were still underway when their entourage was flown by helicopter into Clark Airfield from the presidential palace. But I understand Mrs. Aquino, and more particularly General Ramos, feared that he would be a very bad force if he stayed in the Philippines. And so the Marcoses were taken to Guam. So that is a quotation from the article of Senator Paul Laxalt. So his statement is further substantiated by Secretary of State George Shultz, when he had a personal account in his own book, Turmoil and Triumph. Now, if America did not physically remove President Ferdinand Marcos out of the Philippines, how would Corazon Aquino have entered Malacanang? See, these are questions again. If Marcos was not bombed in Malacanang, he would not have thought of refuge in his home province up in the north. So who bombed Marcos in Malacanang? Still a question which has not been answered to this day. According to the accounts of Time magazine, this is the issue of March 10, 1986, and let me quote. An hour after the ceremony or oath-taking of Marcos in the palace, Marcos telephoned Enrile and demanded that he stop firing at the palace. Enrile said he had no troops there. Marcos asked him to call Ambassador Bosworth to find out if the United States could provide the Marcoses with security in flying out of the palace. Close quote. And from Clark Air Base, why did the United States fly the Marcoses to Guam when President Marcos asked that he be flown to Ilocos Norte? As the duly elected President of the Republic of the Philippines and as duly proclaimed by the National Assembly in accordance with the Constitution, Ferdinand Marcos took his oath of office before the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Philippines. And under the law, the Marcos term of office was for 6 years, and which would have been until 1992. So even granting the nullity of the presidential elections of 1986, Marcos, according to the law, would still have been president until 1988. When the regular presidential elections would have been held. So what law installed the presidency of Corazon Aquino. If it were people power as alleged, what numerical ascendancy can Corazon Aquino claim? So from the basic issue of the illegality of what has been done as far as the proclamation of Mrs. Aquino's government is concerned, and its subsequent recognition by the United States of America, we have the following questions, which are now being, well, it was raised before, but I am repeating them now. Number one, you have the violation of the active state doctrine. The head of a foreign government is told to leave his residence, his office, the seat of power, against his will. Marcos is told to cut and to cut clean by Senator Paul Laxalt. Marcos is transported out of the palace, brought to the U.S. military facility Clark Air Base, and from there transported out of his own country without his consent, based on the request of the political opposition to his presidency. Is this act legitimate just because it is the United States of America performing such an act? According to then Secretary of State George Shultz, the following U.S. officials were involved in the meetings directed at the terminating the Marcos rule. I will mention their names for historical purposes. Congressman Stephen Solarz, Admiral Bill Crow, Michael Armacost, Paul Wolfowitz, Charlie Hill, Gaston Sigur, Nick Platt, John Whitehead, Mort Abramowitz, Peter Rodman, Rich Armitage, Cap Weinberger, John Poindexter, General P.S. Kelly, Philip Habib, Robert Gates, representing Bill Casey, Bernie Cobb, and in Manila, Stephen Bosworth, together with the Foreign Service officers in the staff of Secretary of State George Shultz. So the question is, United States recognition of the Aquino revolutionary government, is legitimacy automatically granted to the Aquino government by virtue of its having taken over the seat of power through the assistance and recognition of the United States government? What happened to the legal basis of the elections in the Philippines? What happened to the constitutional basis of Marcos's election, proclamation, oath of office, and administration? So here you also have the question of the removal of the immunity of a sovereign head of state. Can the Philippine ambassador to the United States legitimately surrender the immunity of his head of state? And thus acceptance of such surrender by the United States government legitimize the act? Where is the document stating the surrender of the immunity of President Ferdinand Edralin Marcos? So in the absence of such a document, of such a surrender, on what basis did the United States Department of Justice acquire jurisdiction to indict President Ferdinand E. Marcos? These are legal questions that we have raised then and we are raising now by way of, by way of coming out with the study of international law and the active state doctrine and the immunity of presidents, which cannot be surrendered except by the president himself. So who surrendered his immunity so that the United States government could have jurisdiction over President Marcos? He is the head of a sovereign state. Now, what is the definition of that phrase, foreign guest? Remember, I showed you some time back the parole visa of President Marcos, and that phrase there, that he is, the parole visa there stated that he was a foreign guest. So based on the letters of President Reagan and Secretary George Shultz addressed to President Marcos, it was dated 26 February 1986, and this was attested to by Donald Reagan, Chief of Staff to the President of the United States. The President, which is the President Reagan, has designated Ferdinand Marcos as a distinguished foreign visitor to the United States. So Does a distinguished foreign visitor have any rights, or is he at the mercy of the foreign US government? Here we have, for instance, some violations that were undertaken by the US Immigration and Naturalization Service law. So here we have the official passports of the Marcoses when they arrived in Honolulu. They were all confiscated. Your passport, when you enter a country, will be confiscated if there is an accusation against you, or if you're a wanted criminal, or there is the warrant of arrest against you. But there was no case yet filed against the Marcoses when they landed in Honolulu, but their passports were confiscated. Why? Under the provisions of the United States law, diplomatic passports of foreign officials are not supposed to be confiscated. So what happened to the diplomatic immunity of the Marcoses? And then you have, again, the question, why were the Marcoses issued parole visas instead of the regular I-94 form? Under what provision of the INS law is a foreign head of state and members of his family to be issued parole visas? So we still have to know if they have a law covering this. Under what circumstances are parole visas being issued? Under what circumstances did the Marcoses enter the United States of America? They did not enter there as tourists or as business investors. He entered there as President of the Republic of the Philippines. So under whose direct authority at the Immigration and Naturalization Office of America in Honolulu, that port of entry, where the Marcoses issued parole visas and that their passports were confiscated. So who issued this? Who was the authority that did this? What kind of law do they have covering this? Anyway. And then again, we have the customs law in the United States of America. Why were the Marcoses' personal effects seized upon entry at the Hickam Military Air Base? What provision of the United States Custom Law authorizes the confiscation and the seizure of the personal effects of a foreign head of state and the members of his family that are traveling with him? What provision in the U.S. Customs Law considers smuggling items and valuables that are brought into the United States on a separate aircraft, arriving several days after the subject persons actually are being accused of smuggling? So here you have those pesos in the carts, and then you have jewelries, and you have several other documents that arrived several days after the President Marcos and his family arrived in Hickam. And then you have President Marcos, his entire entourage, including his grandchildren. One is even just barely 2 months old. They were all accused of smuggling valuables and other items into the United States when such cargo were transported into the United States on a United States Air Force plane that arrived several days after the Marcos landed in Honolulu. These are court records, by the way. That is why I can cite it this way. And so how could a 2-month-old baby deliberately and willfully have knowledge and intent to perform the act of smuggling? As you know, they were accused of that, as a matter of fact. And having seized and confiscated that cargo, what is now the status of the case regarding that cargo and the status of the confiscation regarding those items? So you have there Marcos' personal effects and his documents and his papers and whatever else they owned, but was transported in a different aircraft. So you have there the Federal Bureau of Investigation was used by the Department of Justice of the United States. And all of these documents were eventually used as evidences against the Marcoses in the trials in the United States. So was the seizure of those documents legal? was their acceptance in court as evidence against the owners of those documents. Was that legal? And having been acquitted and found not guilty in the criminal case in New York, where the subject documents were presented, so the documents there were left in the possession of the United States of New York court. Anyway, so there you have the question again: what legal authority does the United States government possess to be able to seize personal documents of a former head of state, whom they call a distinguished foreign visitor, and use those documents against the visitor in the criminal cases they filed in the United States by the United States government itself? And after finding that there was no crime by a unanimous verdict of their own American jury, they still continue to hold on to these documents and then turn this over to the Philippine government to be used again against the Marcoses. So there are many questions here that I'm raising, perhaps for the students of law, for those who are studying political science, geopolitics, those who are studying history. These are questions that will still have to be resolved, and they have to be asked because this is how the most powerful country in the world at the time could enter into another country and accuse its head of state for a crime which, again, as we have said, was something as hilarious as a criminal syndicate by way of running our own government. So, as I said, they could not even read the indictment orally in court because it would sound so, it would sound hilarious when you try to read it, because this involves really the sleazy underworld of the mafiosi and all of this, anyway, crime syndicates that proliferate in, anyway. So we have, again, the violation of the act of state doctrine, because you have the United States of the government filing the RICO statute in violation against the Marcoses, first in Los Angeles and then in New York. So here you have also the intervention of the former ambassador to the Philippines and U.S. State Department Assistant Secretary of State, Michael Armacos, who actually intervened in the dismissal by the appellate court of Los Angeles. So all of this begged for explanations. And then, of course, the injunctions also that were issued by Judge Mariana Felser of the court in Los Angeles, a worldwide freeze on all assets perceived to belong to the Marcoses, it without even the benefit of a judgment of guilt, just by an order of a U.S. court, that all suspected properties and assets of President Ferdinand E. Marcos should be seized. And in addition, she has also, ordered the Marcoses to limit their monthly expenses to $10,000, and that they should make an accounting of their expenses monthly to the court. Why is this being done? By what authority and by what American law is this being done? And what kind of a criminal or civil procedure can they cite to be able to come up with such an order against the Marcoses? Then, of course, you have the tapping of the telephones, etc., and whatever else they could do by way of surveillance. This is the FBI already. So again, you have the violation of private property and the privacy of individuals. But then, of course, there seems to be at the time a special law against the Marcoses. So you have all of these violations, including the violation on the right to travel, the freedom of movement, the right to return to one's own country. And the Marcoses were continuously, regularly ordered not to depart from the United States of America. So there you have unsigned written orders delivered personally to President Marcos. These were delivered by Charles B. Salmon Jr., Director of the Office of Philippine Affairs at Department of State in Washington, Gregory Walden, Associate Deputy Attorney General of the United States Department of Justice in Washington, Abraham Sofayer, the legal advisor to the United States Department of State in Washington. So you have all of these orders, actually. I have seen them. I have copies of them. They're just typewritten on a piece of paper with no, it has no heading, no stationery, not even the stationery signature of any U.S. government office. And, you know, that is why we have to ask, under what law do they do this, you know? Then first, there is a departure order that, well, they cite this, that there is a departure control order that orders you, President Hugh Ferdinand Marcos, not to depart from the United States of America without express authorization, and that a notification forbids you to leave without written permission from the district director of the immigration office in Honolulu. There was also another unsigned typewritten order which stated the following, and I quote, "As we have told you, any attempt to return to the Philippines without the approval of the government of the Philippines would violate the conditions under which you are here as a guest," close quote. So this is dependent on what the Philippine government would allow or not allow at the time under Mrs. Aquino, which the United States of America is following. And so you had an agreement actually between the United States and the Aquino government that the Marcoses were not allowed to return to their own country. So whatever happened to the International Declaration of Human Rights, of which both the United States and the Philippine governments are signatories, which declaration guarantees a citizen's fundamental right to return to his home country. And subsequently, or consequently, you also have Mrs. Marcos, who had to report to the immigration office every single day. Can you imagine that? What a torturous act, actually. So you have here, again, the question that we have to ask, is there any law that governs a distinguished foreign visitor according to what was written under parole visas? Anyway, so again, we go back to the act of state doctrine, because you have a grand jury, for instance, in Virginia, investigating a foreign head of state. And that's the government of President Marcos, who contracted the services of the Westinghouse Company in the construction of the first and only nuclear plant in the Philippines. And the Aquino government objected to the nuclear plant, which at that time was already finished and completed and ready to be operational. And yet the United States government conducted an investigation on the construction of the nuclear plant based on the Aquino government's allegations that there were bribes that were involved. And the Westinghouse Company denied this during the grand jury. I was there witnessing all of this happening inside. Well, of course, the grand jury room was closed to the public. It was only Mrs. Marcos who was allowed inside. Even her lawyer was not allowed to be with her there. And you just had all of these questions around the Westinghouse, and any question that they would want to ask, even though it is not related to the subject matter. That is what a grand jury is. But anyway, why would they conduct a grand jury investigation on the nuclear plant built by Westinghouse involving bribes when Westinghouse already denied this, etc.? So here you have the United States and their authority over the acts of another sovereign head of state over matters outside the jurisdiction of the United States. If a president would want to construct a nuclear plant or a geothermal plant, why would any other government, especially like the United States of America, intervene and say that it should not be done or something was wrong with that construction? That is, again, the violation of that act of state doctrine. So the RICO case that I've mentioned so many times is also a violation of that act of state doctrine. But then, of course, it was also a conspiracy complaint that was filed, so that even Mrs. Marcos was included in that particular charge. So you can imagine or try to visualize the intention of the United States and the Justice Departments to picture the Marcos government as a criminal enterprise under that RICO statute. And that, and notwithstanding the fact that President Marcos is recognized and acclaimed by 5 US presidents, and that he was an ally of the United States, and that he also was a soldier in the last World War, defending our country together with the United States Armed Forces here in the Far East. And then, of course, how ridiculous it would appear that with all of that history behind President Marcos, he would not be considered as a criminal running the government of the Philippines as a criminal syndicate. They are even, they are eating their own law in a way, so to speak. So again, those questions. That is why I'm posing all of this, because many of the things I've discussed in the past actually revolve about these questions legally, and violations of which were done just so that they could prosecute the Marcoses. You also had violations of the court's judgment. For instance, there was already the unanimous decision of the 12-member jury of the court in New York, and the verdict was not guilty. This means that the United States government could not show proof that the Marcoses stole the money of the Filipino people, and that money was used to purchase those forced buildings in New York. So despite all of these things that I've been talking about, 350,000 documents, 95 witnesses, 4 months of the trial, etc., and the fact also that Diane Nicholson was a schoolmate of Mrs. Corazon Aquino, and Diane Nicholson happened to be the wife of Judge John F. Keenan in that New York courthouse. But then again, the question there is, what happened to the 4 buildings? Not guilty in decision. That means walang ginamit na dirty money, so to speak, if they would want to call it that bought those buildings. What happened to the buildings when Mrs. Marcos was acquitted, was considered not guilty by that unanimous verdict of the jury? Well, the governments of the United States of America and the Philippine government sold them. Why? What authority do they have to sell them? They do not own those buildings. So how much was the profit from those sale? Where did the profit go? What happened to the Samuels collection that was also part of the accusation? And it's also subject of the case. And so you have these 2 governments that also sold them. Why? What right do they have? What law can they invoke to sell them? Again, what happened to the jewelries? That is also the subject of the case. We only saw the pictures of them in the courtroom. What happened to the Philippine pesos that were confiscated at the F.E.M Air Base, which came in a different US aircraft? And all the documents that were used, what happened to them? Well, anyway, we know what happened to them. Some of them found their way again in our Philippine courts for the trial again, repeatedly, of what was already done in the New York courthouse. But anyway, going back to those violations on the right to travel. So even though Mrs. Marcos was already given the verdict of not guilty, she was still not allowed to travel outside of the United States of America. There was a special Immigration and Naturalization Form, INS as we call it, an INS form that was made regarding her movements within the United States. The form compelled her to indicate the exact time and date that she is to depart, or her point of departure, or her point of arrival, the means of transport she's going to take. This is within the United States of America. The persons accompanying her on her trip, the number of hours or days that she is going to stay at the intended place, the purpose and nature of her trip, and the attestation of her lawyer that she is to report all her movements to the INS upon the completion of her travel. And this form was issued after the verdict of her innocence. She still had to follow all of these requirements, even though she was traveling within United States territory. And this is something which I think will also shock you. It is also the Federal Aviation Authority ruling barring or forbidding the transport of the remains of President Ferdinand E. Marcos outside of the island of Oahu, outside of Honolulu. So even the dead was not spared, because the Aquino government refused to have the remains of President Marcos interred in his own homeland. And the United States government dutifully complied. By virtue of a special Federal Aviation Authority ruling of the United States of America, the specific details actually are listed down here. So in effect, the FAA said that no aircraft or sea vessel is allowed to transport the remains of the late president out of the island of Oahu under pain of sanctions and liabilities imposed by that special ruling. A special ruling by the Federal Aviation Authority of the United States of America. And the reason is President Marcos' remains were a threat to the security of the aircraft and to the national security of the Philippines. That is written there. So I told you it would shock you. So all of you who are listening, students of law or lawyers, actually, perhaps you could look into this and really squint a little bit and determine what kind of actions the United States, America, has done against the Marcoses. And so you had a special law only for the Marcoses. And so, again, the question of the dismissal of some cases in the human rights civil case that was done, that was held in Honolulu. So you had there the dismissal by Judges Harold Fong in Honolulu and by Spencer Williams in San Francisco. How did they get remanded back to the court of Judge Real in Los Angeles? What happened to the questions of jurisdiction, the active state doctrine, and the other questions of law statement in the judgments of the courts? I've already read this. I've read the judgments and I've read what the justices of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals have said. So anyway, I'm not going to go over that again, but again, the questions come up. So here we have the application of all of this as far as the Marcoses are concerned. So we have here, for instance, the Alien Tort Claims Act, which is actually an American law. These are acts occurring wholly in a foreign jurisdiction and engaged by foreign nationals against foreign nationals. So what happened there if the district court improperly admitted certain hearsay statements and hearsay written documents? So again, all of these are questions which perhaps we really have to be going over. All of this segue now into the Swiss government that froze whatever is suspected to be the assets of Ferdinand Edelin Marcos and the Swiss banks. Again, there was still no decision by any court in Switzerland that already gave them the authority, or the banks the authority, to freeze these assets. As a matter of fact, when that happened, there was an uproar in Switzerland why this is being done. And they tried to quiet this down in the papers, to quell it actually as much as they could, because then you have again that violation of the privacy rights of individuals or of foundations or other nominees in the Swiss banks, which should undergo the due process before the Swiss banks could order the freezing. So there you have the Swiss actions taken against the Marcoses. And all of this that has been done by the United States of America has also been part of the of what has been done by the Swiss government. So I am actually putting this all together for the sake of, well, finding out the answers and the resolutions to the questions I have raised, the violations of certain laws, not ours, or perhaps international law, which also belong to us, Philippine laws also for that matter, and the United States of America laws that like the the Torts Act that they have also, and several others that students of law and lawyers could look into. This is something which is already in the past, 35 years ago, but these are questions that seem to they don't hibernate. They just float around like an albatross. And so you could see the machinations, maneuverings, and manipulations that could be done by foreign governments or by a powerful government that can use its bureaucratic power to enter into the governments of other countries if they do not agree with the way that government functions, or they do not agree with the way the head of state should be following what they should be doing as far as Washington is concerned. So again, this is something which is tied up to this summit on democracy, because what kind of a democracy is actually being practiced as far as the rights of sovereign states are concerned, to be independent of foreign colonizers. Remember, America colonized us for 45 years, and it still believes that we are the little brown brother. So there you have that kind of umbilical cord, which has not been completely severed. And now that we have this summit on democracy, and of course, our own President Duterte spoke there and emphasized the fact that there should really be some kind of a constructive manner by which governments are supposed to deal with one another. And that is where our foreign policy should also strengthen itself as far as big powers are concerned. And this refers not just to the United States of America, but also to the other evolving world powers, economic and military as may be: India, the United Kingdom, Australia, the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, all of this that actually sit in the Security Council of the United Nations. So again, so that the world will not actually witness or experience again another Cold War. Let us hope for the best, and let us pray that all these interventions coming from powers that are alien to us would not disrupt our forthcoming elections in May next year. We know this as part of the invisible hand or the invisible tentacles of particularly foreign governments, and specifically the United States of America, moving into the electoral process in our country. We know this as part of our suffrage history, and let us hope for the best, that this is now a new generation, and that the will of the people coming from this mindset that has now been afflicted by a virus that has been causing so many difficulties, problems, and lives also, may be able to come up with a voice that is actually different from what it has been in the past. So let us pray for this. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is in connection with the Summit on Democracy, which perhaps later on I would discuss more in detail. But as a closure for the many things that I have discussed, you have seen here the questions raised of the laws that were undertaken to be just specifically violated, or that were, reformatted, if I am going to be polite about it, by the United States of America and by the Swiss government insofar as the Marcoses are concerned. Sad, but that's the way geopolitics operates, and now we are at a different platform altogether. I'd like to close our program with a prayer, especially during this period that we are experiencing now, a lull in the cases of this COVID-19 and other variants of this virus. So dear God, we are actually begging you and asking you to walk with us again and again through this period of this virus, and opening our hearts for your guidance, so that we may be able to have the strength to share your love with others. And through this time of uncertainty, that we will look at each day as a celebration of your greatness. And please make us ready to receive your blessings and to share this with everyone. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Thank you for having joined me. This has been your hour, and this is Rita Gadi.